as she said, I'm John Coggeshall. A little bit about me as it relates to PHP and kind of personally. I just built a metal foundry at home. I melt aluminum cans at home because I got tired of hanging out and trying to, in Michigan you have to return them for 10 cents and this was a lot more fun. So I make aluminum ingots and stuff. I just built that. I love my boat, which is currently in pieces. I'm here instead of putting it back together for this season, but that's fine. As a PHP guy, I've been involved with PHP for a long time, since about 1996, which is an obscene amount of time to be doing anything. 18 years, I guess, or something close to that. I've published lots of things related to PHP, a number of books, more articles than I care to count. I speak all over the place on PHP and kind of open source topics, and I'm here to talk to you about all things for PHP 7. So PHP 7 is the next major iteration of PHP. If you haven't really been following, I don't know how many of you are developers that are actively involved in PHP or just kind of use it or are interested in kind of understanding what's happened. But it's the next major iteration. You'll notice that PHP 6 kind of got skipped over. There was once upon a time where PHP 6 was supposed to be the next great thing, and that fell apart. What happened basically with it? Well, PHP 6 is dead. We decided to not call anything PHP 6 as to not confuse people. Strangely enough, people publish books on PHP 6, even though PHP 6 never really materialized. The big thing in PHP 6 was going to be Unicode support. So being able to write code in Chinese or use Chinese characters for variable names, and then also being able to handle Chinese and strings more effectively, stuff like that. That was going to be the big push. It was going to be a major engine rewrite. And kind of what happened was that whole thing was being spearheaded by one guy. His name was Andre, and he was working for Yahoo at the time, and Yahoo was paying him to work on it. And then Andre left Yahoo and didn't want to work on it anymore, and nobody else wanted to work on it either. So it just sort of stagnated and eventually actually died. That's kind of why, if you'll notice, in the PHP 5 series, 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, these point releases have like these major features in them. There's another talk I saw actually giving at the same time right now, talking about, I think, 5.6. And then what's new in 5.6 and things. But we introduced traits and namespaces and all this stuff in these point releases, mostly because PHP 6's as a code base was all messed up. Those all really should have been part of the PHP 6 release, that ever happened. But since the Unicode stuff never got done, we just kind of put in the PHP 5. PHP 7, however, is a lot more popular. It's got a lot of great new features. We're going to talk about all that sort of stuff, or at least the big ones in this talk. And it's going to be in GA. The timeline is we're really hoping to have this thing in general release for 2015, for fall 2015. So with all that said, a little bit of a warning, everything I tell you here could be wrong. It is under development. I'm relatively confident about everything I'm saying here. I'm pretty positive about a lot of it, because a lot of it's actually already implemented, a lot of it already exists. I probably got the release date wrong. It's an open source project. It could be next spring, who knows. There aren't RFCs for everything that is in the code base, which means that there could be new RFCs or things could change. Like I said, take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I'm speaking as authoritatively as you're going to get. So let's talk about error handling. First thing in PHP 7, and you'll note here in the upper right-hand corner, I have this little oh yeah and hell no box. These were the vote counts on the feature in the RFCs. So if you're not aware of how PHP kind of does things nowadays, we've left the Wild West as far as how features get in. I can tell you stories about how simple XML got into PHP. And now we have an actual RFC process where people write proposals and there's some sort of structure, and then people vote on proposals. And so for some features, it's just a simple majority. For changing the language in any sort of way, it requires 2/3 consent of the voting members. And the way we count voting members is anybody who has commit access. So we're still pretty open. But keep an eye on that, because some of these features, I was amused by how the voting went. Death of eStrict. So in PHP 7, eStrict was the way, or in PHP 5 and the PHP 5 series, eStrict was the way that we told developers you were doing something bad, don't do it anymore. And it was kind of just sort of a warning, like, hey, this is a bad practice. And in PHP 7, we got rid of that. Everything has either been upgraded to an actual error, or we've now said that, hey, we're going to actually remove this in a future version instead of just warning you not to do it. Or we promoted it, of course, to an e-notice or e-warning. So anything that was eStrict in your old code, now is the time to change it for your new code. Otherwise, you're going to have one of these problems to deal with. And with error handling, call to member function of So this is something that's come up relatively recently in the PHP space, especially with PHP 5, and with the continued enhancement of the PHP object model. This was a really annoying error that would happen, and basically what it was is that if you had an object foo and you tried to access a property baz, that may or may not be null. And then you would try to do something with that, like call a method, because it was supposed to be an object, right? In PHP 5, this is a fatal error, blows up the entire application and grinds everything to a screaming halt. And it's super annoying, especially with all the frameworks nowadays. Everything's object-oriented and stuff. And sometimes a null is not necessarily the end of the world. And so instead of having to necessarily check for that all the time, in PHP 7, we changed that to a recoverable error. So you can actually catch it in an error handler and deal with it without necessarily grinding the application to a complete halt. At the bottom here also, you'll notice that I put a URL. When I put these slides online, actually they're already online. When you go to download these slides, if you want to read about the feature in more detail, there are links to all the RFCs as well. So you can read all the nasty details. Next, we have engine exceptions. So PHP 7, we're trying to move into an exception model for the way we deal with errors in general, which is, of course, going to be pretty useful. So this is actually broken down into two separate things. One, PHP 7 is going to replace e-errors and things like that with exceptions. Most of the common ones now will throw exceptions instead of throwing an e-error, so you'll be able to do your try-catch blocks and deal with things normally. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them will. And if possible, everything in the future by standard is going to be exception-based instead of e-error-based. We also introduced an entirely new exception object model. And so I've kind of laid out what that looks like. The punchline here is that right now in PHP 5, the base exception class is the exception class, right? So in PHP 7, the base exception class is going to be called base exception, and then exception will inherit from that. And we also introduced two more exceptions, the engine exception and the parse exception. And those are going to be the ones that are thrown internally. So we did the reason we did it this way is because by not just but if we made engine exception extend from exception, we could create some weird backward compatibility issues where people are just trying to catch exceptions and they're catching parser exceptions. So we wanted those errors to still be thrown by default, and we still wanted apps to break if you had a parser error, but we didn't want to necessarily, but we wanted to be able to have exceptions. So we made them kind of equal level and added a new base exception there. If you guys have any questions about any of this stuff as I'm going, please feel free to interrupt me as well.
So I think right now in existing code, if this stays PHP 7 and we go to this, we have a try catch block for exception. It's not going to catch parse exception.
Right, which is not what it would catch normally either, right? So normally that would be an e-error. So you're still having kind of basically the same behavior. You know, instead of an e-error, there was an exception thrown, but the result's the same. You know, your application still halts. But now you can catch that. You can expand that catch block to something more generic than even just exception. Any other questions? Cool.
Well, I mean,
sure.
I'm not the most apt person on PHP, but I mean, if you can include somebody else's module in runtime and it has a parse exception, Can you catch a parse exception if you want to?
Yes. I'm honestly a little bit unclear on how and where this actually applies. I'd have to go look at the RFC. One thought that comes to mind, for example, though, is maybe an eval, where you're evaluating a piece of code. I don't know why you'd want to use eval. But if you include, if you include a library and it bars on the exception, I'd have to look at the engine more detail to find out exactly how deep you go, because there's a point where that doesn't work, right? It doesn't matter, it's not gonna. You can't have code to catch a parse exception all the time, but they're in there for the cases where it's actually something that you could handle and address. Any other question? All right, so let's talk about objects and stuff. So the first one. Wait, what? This was actually broken? So in current versions of PHP, some of the internal classes that we have will allow you to construct them in a broken state and cause weird errors. So an example here is creating a new reflection function class and not passing it in a function name, instead passing it in something like an array. This would throw a warning and say, hey, you didn't give me a function name, but it would still construct the object, right? And then you could call get parameters and it would blow up or do something weird. And so in PHP 7, we fixed all of these. So all the internal classes now actually kind of adhere to object-oriented principles. So if you construct an object and it doesn't work, you don't get the object, you get an exception. And so it was just some broken stuff. We don't want to have broken instances. Speaking of constructors as well, the object constructors having the same name as the class, which is something that came all the way back from PHP 4 days. So if you had a class foo and you had a function foo, PHP treated the function foo like a constructor and would call it when you said A equals new class foo. This is finally dying to the relief of all people, all serious developers. So methods that are named the same thing as the class, for example, a filter class with a method filter, are just methods now. Constructors are the __ construct that's been around forever. And in PHP 7, if you try to do this sort of stuff, we're going to throw a warning and yell at you and scream at you about this sort of stuff. So we're not there yet where we're going to completely stop doing it, and we're still going to honor the code for a while, but in a future version here, we are going to completely remove it. So this is kind of our warning to developers saying, you better actually stop using that really broken PHP 4 class and upgrade it or do something with it. Any questions? Cool. Simplified You statements. So this is a bit of little syntactic sugar. I personally don't care about this as a feature because I use an IDE that sort of deals with the use statements. But a lot of people say, hey, we shouldn't have to use an IDE to write clean code, and that's a valid point. So we introduced this syntax here where you can use some brackets and some commas and import a number of classes within the same namespace instead of having to use 3 different lines to do the same thing.
Does that only apply to namespaces?
Well, it would apply to, in what sense? I mean, uses for namespaces, so.
Traits.
Yeah, no, traits or anything where you're using a use statement. Actually, that's a really good question. I don't know if it's going to work in a class, like if you're using use for a trait.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that offhand. The RFC, if you read it, it might say that. I would suspect yes. I mean, I think that'd be really weird if they didn't do it across the board. But I can't remember reading that specifically when I read the RFC. So, good question though. So, some language features. Spaceships. So PHP 7 introduces what's called the combined comparison operator. And this has been named by people other than me, the Spaceship Operator. And it's the one, it's just the greater than sign, well, less than equals and then greater than, so it looks kind of like a spaceship. And it's basically very similar to strcomp in a way. So if you're used to the way strcomp returns something, it returns -1 or +1 or 0, depending on how things match up. So the Spaceship Operator basically works the same way. So you can see here on the left-hand side, the various different logical operations that are known to everybody. And then here on the right, kind of what you'll get using the Spaceship Operator for that. So a less than would return -1, a equivalent, less than or equal, would return either a -1 or a 0, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a little piece of operator magic. It's useful in a lot of different cases when you're comparing things together. And so we introduced it into PHP 7. We also introduced the question mark operator. No, that wasn't a placeholder in my slides. It's a real operator. And the operator is basically a null call-esque operator. So it allows us to set default values for variables when the variable doesn't already exist. So here's an example. We deal with a lot of user input, obviously, in PHP. And so if you have your super global get user, you can say user equals get user question mark nobody. So it's basically a way of setting a default value for a variable that doesn't already exist. Some frameworks do this naturally already. I've been writing a lot of Laravel code lately. And so when you use the input class, there's always that second parameter you can specify for a default value if it's not set. And this is just bringing that kind of concept into the language itself. So return types. This was awesome. I have been yelling and screaming and wanting return types ever since they introduced any sort of type hinting into PHP, which was like 10 years ago at this point. So in PHP 7, we will finally have return types. You can see the syntax built down there. So returns array, colon, and then a class or some sort of type that you want to return. And it will make sure that when that function or method or whatever returns, that it actually is returning the appropriate type. So you can now kind of do a lot more design by contract sort of stuff, and you can return an interface and make sure, you don't have to check to make sure that you got the interface back. And so it allows you to write cleaner, tighter code. It does have a downside. At the moment, the PHP 7 plans do not have the notion of nullable types. So in this case, you have a return array, and it's expected to return array. If you return null, it's going to blow up and yell at you and say, function must return array. That's still being debated, I think, to a certain extent. The RFC, I don't think would have passed if they had required nullables. There's arguments on both sides for that, but hopefully soon. So that's the one caveat, is if you do specify a return type, you better return that type.
Does that also apply to returns and yours?
Well, whatever we can type, and that's actually my next. So type hinting is another feature that we'll get to. But anything that any type that you can specify, it doesn't accept you to pass return null as a valid answer for that type. So some uniform variable syntax. So PHP has always been a little weird with its syntax with variables. It's got the variables and the subarrays and the objects and stuff like that. And so in PHP 7, all of the oddities about it, at least now, are consistently applied across the language. So you can do all sorts of really crazy one-liner sort of stuff now if you want to, and it's all going to work. For example, I have a method, or I have a function whose variable or whose name is stored in the variable foo. It returns an array with a bar in it, and then I access that bar and call it as a function. So calling a closure and a return array, all these different kind of syntaxes where you want to be able to just shorthand something, call a function which returns a function which returns a function. You can just put 3 sets of parentheses after it, and it'll call the third one down. There was a lot of inconsistency before in PHP. Like some of this stuff simply wouldn't work, and some of it didn't really work the right way. So I would encourage you to look at the RFC. I just put an example here, but the RFC really lays out all the rules. And there are a couple things that if you're doing them, they're going to behave differently now. So this is a potential backward compatibility issue. But most people weren't doing it at all. You know, it was just inconsistent for the language. So we cleaned all of that up. All those weird PHP arcane open tags that I totally even forgot existed are actually gone now in PHP 7. So you can no longer use ASP style tags to write your PHP code. You can't use script language equals PHP. Those actually are valid things still. And also hexadecimal support for numeric strings has been removed because it was totally broken. It made no sense at all. So before, if you had the hexadecimal string 0x01, that would equal integer 1. But if you cast it to an integer before you did the comparison, it would be false. And that was because the way the casting works, int would look at the first number in the string, see a 0, and say, oh, well, that's obviously 0, and just return 0. It wouldn't interpret it as a hexadecimal string, because that also could look like an MD5 hash, for example. So they erred on the side of treating, you know, the very first character. So now we don't do hexadecimal strings at all. We don't parse them. We just throw them away. We treat them as simply as strings. So 0x01 is not a hexadecimal value anymore to PHP. It's just a string of 0x01. One of my favorite features, I was actually, I very well could have been the tipping vote. I know if you look up there, the votes there say 108 to 48, but 5 minutes or 10, like 2 hours or something like that before closing, it was literally on the wire of 2/3. And I got an email from Derek Ruthens, who's another core contributor, and he's like, please vote for this because we're never going to get it again if it doesn't pass. And so once I voted and once it tipped over, a lot of people changed their votes to support it and just say, okay, if everyone wants it, we'll do it. But scalar type hinting has been introduced in PHP 7. It's a little weird. But it's there. So we can now say that a function returns or accepts a scalar type, a float, for example, or an int, strings like that. And then, but the enforcement of that type is file dependent. So at the top of the file there, we have this declare strict types equals 1, which means that this file, when it's interpreted, will actually honor those strict casting rules. If that's not on the top there, they're just basically ignored. And this is the best thing we could come up with from a backward compatibility notion. So at the top of the file, we'll enforce strict typing of values only if we have strict types equals 1, and that allows developers themselves to kind of declare whether or not we want to honor it, and things like that.
There's no way to do it globally then?
No, it's per file. It's implemented per file. So it's this was a really painful notion for PHP to get it all. PHP for 20 years has fought tooth and nail as a community to not be Java and not have strict types and stuff. But it's getting to the point now where I think a number of things have kind of pushed us to the point where we understand we need it, but we also have all the 20 years of code that we still want people to be able to run, and so this was the best compromise that we could come up with, which was it's good. It's great that we actually have it now. It does allow the like a library developer to kind of have strict typing within his own world without requiring somebody else to kind of also play the same rules, which is the intent. But yeah, it's there. And so you can use float, integers, things like that. The full details and all the comments are down there in the RFC if you want to see it. Did you have a question?
So what happens if I require another file or auto load a class?
Well, you auto-load a class and you try to pass into that class and it's strict typed, and you try to pass into that and they're enforcing strict types, it's going to yell at you. It's going to say, hey, I wanted an integer. If you are and they're not, then you kind of sign up for that, right? You don't know what you're getting back necessarily. So, it's really up to the file to determine whether or not it itself is going to honor strict typing rules or not. And if it does, then you kind of know that walking in when you use the library, right? So you got to be more careful one way or another. Any other questions? Cool. Lists changed. So I actually use this surprisingly often. Writing code nowadays, it seems like a lot of frameworks pass around arrays of data, and sometimes you want to just pull out a specific value or break it out into variables. List has been a good way of doing that. So if you don't know what list is, it's a left-hand side statement, which is a little weird. So if you have list ABC and you give it and you say that equals an array, it will actually assign variable A to an item in the array, variable B to the other item, variable C to the third item. Currently, in PHP 5, the variables are assigned right to left. So in our little example here, we have a variable A, we have lists, and we just use the A array to just capture the order that the variables are assigned. And we say equals 1, 2, 3. So in the old way, that would equal 3, 2, 1. And that's how the array would be assigned. And in PHP 7, that's actually been reversed. And now it will be 1, 2, 3 instead. So this could actually be a potentially pretty serious backward compatibility. Well, it will be a very serious backward compatibility change for any code that's using list, because now the variables will be reversed when they're assigned, and that will all have to be updated. The reason for this, though, is I think it primarily had to do with the fact that we changed a lot of engine improvements. We introduced an abstract syntax tree to the way we compile things. A lot of that has to do with performance and optimizations and things that we couldn't do otherwise. So we had to do that sort of stuff. But because of the nature of that implementation, because of the nature of what we were doing there, we're kind of forced to bite the bullet on this one and change that assignment order. So also, lists no longer extract values from strings. So you can't use list to pull out, the first character or the second character anymore. It will throw it. So strings aren't being interpreted by lists as arrays anymore.
So if you're reporting, PHP 5 to PHP 7 someday, and you want to get the big list of all the things to watch out for, you have some kind of code that you can check that says, oh, these are things you might need to look at.
As far as I know so far, there is no magical program to run to parse out PHP code and throw up problems and say, hey, this isn't going to work or that's not going to work. You're more than welcome to write one. But and then not to say maybe in the future,
I mean, sometimes like the parser is just automatically going to help you, so no worries, right?
Right.
But this is just scary.
Yeah. There's not much like this so far. I mean, this is probably one of the few that are that and I'll have to make sure of that. But I think this was really the only one that I looked at. I was like, oh, that's going to break a lot of code. But it's a really easy fix. Obviously, you just kind of change the order of the variables in the code. But it is a perhaps dangerous change. So that's why I'm giving these talks, and that's why people are coming. Hopefully, people read the change log and and I would hope and expect personally that we would release PHP 7 with some sort of backward compatibility doc that would explain the major backward compatibility breaks, so that people can read that and kind of know what to look for at the very least. If not, actually have some sort of script to process that code for you. Right. Like list in each, I think that was like the old school or was it list and each they used together? Yeah, it was like the original way in PHP 3 used to do it, to like loop through stuff like that. Yeah, it's gonna change. It's gonna be reversed. So heads up, pay attention. Any other questions? Cool. So one of the big features in PHP 7 is something called PHP NG. I think NG stands for Next Generation. It was a branch that was originally kind of spearheaded by Zend and the internals developers that they use that work on the PHP core on their dime. And it was all about improving the performance of PHP in general. It was actually originally intended to explore the idea of doing just-in-time compiling for PHP. And the result of it was just tons of optimizations to the PHP engine and the way we did things and stuff like that. It goes a lot faster now. So PHP 6 is in blue, and PHP NG is in green. So that's the direct comparison between PHP 5 and PHP 7 in terms of performance of these various different frameworks. And then the other ones are HHVM, which is the Facebook engine for PHP, and its performance against all of them as well. So a lot faster, and it's one step closer to like a meaningful JIT. And you'll notice kind of a lot of the things in PHP 7 are really trying to get to the point where you're going to have the ability to do like real JITting that you can see in Java and things like that. You know, type hinting and performance improvements, abstract syntax trees. All this stuff is kind of bringing PHP closer to being able to actually be compiled down into at least in part machine code. And so that's about everything that's in PHP 7 as of right now. The new great stuff. Like all things, it's a moving target until it's done. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to get implemented. I'm sure details will change, but it is all there. If you want to play with PHP 7, there is a virtual box to toy around with that Rasmus Leerdorf, who, if you don't know who he is, he's the guy who started PHP. He's got one out there on GitHub. Is it GitHub? Yeah. He's got one out there on GitHub that you can check out, and he'll fire up a PHP 7 build that you can play with. The RFC wiki is a really great source of all more details and everything we've discussed and the things currently being considered. So if you go to wiki.php.net/RFC, you'll see all those different RFCs for PHP 7, the comments and the discussions, and a lot more detail as far as, you know, different code examples and stuff. The RFCs are really pretty verbose for the features. So you can really kind of get your head wrapped around it and kind of see where things are. And that is all I have. So do you guys have any other questions or comments, thoughts about PHP 7 stuff? Because we do have a little bit of time. Go ahead. Yeah.
I noticed in some of your examples, like where you were doing the typing on the return statement and also the strict declaration, that you guys have come up with new syntax, like where you've got the colon float,
sure,
declare strict type. Any reason why you didn't just want to parse out like comments? Because usually,
like annotations sort of stuff.
Like we already declare the type of the return in the comments, or the types of the variables and the type or the arguments and that kind of stuff. And it'd be really easy to throw in a strict in there as well or something.
So I don't want to. I simply can't speak for everybody, right? My argument against doing that is the very argument you just said, which is that people are already using that sort of stuff. It's applied very inconsistently. You know, I mean, are they typing into it? It's comments have never been a syntactical requirement of PHP, and to suddenly make comments part of the syntax of the language would probably be disastrous. And that would be my best guess. Like the only way to do something like this without breaking everyone's code, just carte blanche, is to introduce something new, or at least build off of something pre-existing. So, you know, for parameter type hints, we already had the notion of type hinting. So we can just build off of that and add the scalar type hinting to that. But for return type hints, if we tried to use the comment stuff, that might work for a couple of the projects that are good about that. But it's, I can think of thousands of code examples off the top of my head where that comment block is like, return foo, or whatever, and PHP will interpret that as a type and it'll just break. And it's like, why did my code break? Well, you have a weird comment. And that's a bad answer. You don't want to say, well, your comment was weird. That's why your code doesn't work, right? So that would be my guess is the biggest reason why not.
So what is your most hopeful feature that you wanted for PHP 7 that didn't make it?
Oh, I don't know. I got what I wanted. I really just wanted return type hints. I mean, I was okay even. Scalar type hints are nice. I kind of accepted the idea that, it was unnecessary, or at least I was willing to write the code to care that much if I cared. But it's easy enough to cast stuff, right? It's easy enough to cast a float to an int when the function starts. Return type hinting was the biggest one because that sort of was the second half of the equation. It was really hard to do design by contract and have like proper interfaces and really do it, use those object-oriented principles when you couldn't dictate that you were going to get a class back. And so for me personally, I was very happy with that. While I'm thinking about it, by the way, float is kind of a special example. So we will do a little magic for you with floats. If you give us integers, like add 1, 2, we will treat the integers like floats. So we'll cast them that way for you automatically. So it's not super strict where it's like you didn't put a 0.0 at the end of your integer value. We'll do that cast automatically.
I read an article that was saying that there was going to be methods on scalar type.
Methods on scale. What do you mean by that?
Like you'd have a string, and all of a sudden you could put an arrow and say, length or.
Why would you do that?
Like Ruby or
No. They're. I am unaware of any. You're really talking about object-based scalar types, right? I am unaware of anything in PHP that's doing that. That's not to say that something's cropped up, but scalars are scalars, as far as I know. Maybe PHP 8. There's nothing stopping you, for example, from, and this has always been true, right? There's nothing stopping you from having like a string type. In fact, a lot of frameworks do have a string type, to do stuff like that. But I would be really surprised to find out that scalars had any sort of methods attached to them.
Those people have done auto boxing. I don't know if you've seen that, but does some kind of weird trick with references.
Yeah.
So that a string looks like an object and has methods on it.
So are they like? It's like an engine extension or something that allows?
No, check it out. It's called auto boxing. It's wild.
That's not syntactically valid in PHP. They've got to be.
No, it's really an object, but when it casts, two-string, it'll cast whatever you need.
Oh.
And you can, because of references, you can assign it something, and it'll actually be valid. You put something in the destruct and stuff like that. It's really
Okay.
valid.
Okay.
Anyway,
I would never do that. But okay. So. Yeah, as far as I know, though, to answer your original question, as far as I know, there is not. We are not making scalar type string or objects. So.
Do you foresee any way possible to have a project where you could just say everything is strict types and then have to do it on code?
Well, open source projects are political beasts,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I know we've been watching this one actually pretty closely at my work. So.
Right. Like they're very political beasts. Everyone's got an opinion. There's some relatively strong arguments on all sides. There's typically two camps. There's, the forward thinkers that are annoyed by language features missing, and then there are, see potential for performance improvements and this and that and everything else if we introduce different features. Then there's the camp of guys that simply say PHP is not Java, go find a new language. And then there's the group that really cares about backward compatibility and I think whether you realize it or not, backward compatibility is a very important subject. Because if we just break off, like if code won't run on the next major version, there's always the chance that as a language, right? Like the developer will say, well, screw it, I'll write it in Ruby. If I got to rewrite everything anyway, I'll rewrite it in a different language, right? So it really can impact very much adoption and very much impact the health of the entire language as a whole. So,
Just like a Python 2 versus 3. Yeah.
right. It's like,
will we ever feel like we're all the way on 3 for Python?
right, it's like Perl 5 versus Perl whatever. But it's so we're very conscious of that, I think, as a community, and especially the more corporate views, the people that have a much more financial stake in PHP versus just the users who just want to hack on it. And so there's a lot of pushback always on that sort of stuff. Not to say that progress obviously doesn't get made, but it gets made in painfully small increments. And this is, a decent first step, at least, to the point of maybe 7.2 or 7.3 may introduce a concept of, an INI directive or something you can do to just kind of turn on strict typing. But that only is going to get I think that from a political perspective, that is only going to happen once most people are writing PHP 7 code and the community at large has kind of validated that they really want type hinting by, all Symfony library code is going to be strict typed, and all Zen Framework 3 codes is all strict typed. And, you get all these different code bases that are doing that, and you kind of shift the community along the road. And then once the majority of people are doing that, then we can go back and instead of saying, here's a brand new thing that's going to break all your code and you're just going to have to deal with it, we get to say, here's a minor BC break that's probably not going to hurt you that much because you've already basically switched over.
Correlation would be the fact that you're kind of dropping off the construct function.
Right, but we're not, right? We're not. We're just throwing a warning, right? It's like 15 years old.
To the point where, because that's always a big one, like when someone's first gets in there.
Right. Well, there's a bazillion pair libraries out there that, I don't know how many of them have updated at this point, but I mean, pair was, the biggest offender of this was, for a while that's what they were doing. But even now, even with PHP 7, we're still not getting rid of it. We're still just politely asking you to stop doing it. So yeah. Any other questions? Sure.
Are there any security improvements happening outside of maybe that Hexadecimal change?
I'm not.
Being exploited a lot.
Yeah, I don't know how you could exploit that Hexadecimal one. I'm sure there might be some. With file uploads. There are always security improvements. They won't show up in RFCs. An example of a security-related thing that would have shown up in an RFC would have been, the PHP 5 filter extension, where we kind of provide a better thing. I know that there are features, and I think most of them are already released, that were security-focused in the later part of the 5 series. We provide like a password hashing function now to create password hashes because we discovered that most people have no idea what they're doing with cryptography and write really broken hashing kind of things that are really easy to crack. And so we implemented some nice internal, I think it's called password hash, that will take care of all the complications without having to, be too worried about it. I'm unaware of anything specifically in PHP 7 that was an RFC that is like a security feature. There's no, not to say it may not exist, but and if there's security holes, obviously they just get patched in point releases or things like that, as normal. So, any other questions? Wonderful. All right, so my website is Coggeshall. Oops. Well, let me play from current slide. So my website is coggeshall.org. These slides, I believe, should already be up there. So you feel free to download them and share them. Use whatever you want with them. They're all on SlideShare. You can find me at Google or through my website. And thank you very much.